Hi, Steve Cassidy here. I'm going to talk today about application architectures, and in particular this idea of model view controller and some of the reasons why we organize our applications in this kind of a way. So model view controller is the way of organizing a web application. Let's have a look at the picture that we sort of develop, and here's my version of model view controller diagram. The big idea behind model view controller is that there are ways of organizing our web application that make it easier to manage that web application development and maintenance. Instead of having one big file full of code with everything mixed together, we separate things out into different parts so that each of the different parts can be maintained by themselves, have sort of a job to do, if you like, and then are easily manageable, and gives us a way of thinking about the application and thinking about how it goes together. And it's always good to have a framework to work within when you're thinking about an application that can get quite complicated. All the examples that we've seen so far are fairly simple, and so could be written in lots of different ways. Perhaps as your web application gets more complicated, so the need to have a structure around it becomes more important. So model view controller, let's have a look at this diagram. The different parts of the MVC model or architecture are the model down here, and the model is the part that understands and talks to the database. So the database here is our SQLite or MySQL database, and the model is the part that it provides an interface to that database for the rest of the application. So this part here of the application is the stuff that, in simple terms, has all the SQL in it. All the SQL is in that part, and it presents a way for the rest of the application, in particular the controller, to access the stored data. And so we separate that part out like that. That's the only bit that needs to know about SQL, and then it abstracts that a little bit. And then we have the controller part. The controller part is the bit that sort of controls the logic of the application, what happens when in response to what requests. It decides when to go and get things from the database, and it decides what views that should be executed to generate the response. And then the third part is the view, and this is the bit that is about generating the output that we're going to send back to the browser. And so this is about generating web pages and inserting data that comes from the database model, inserting data or doing things according to the whim of the controller. It will do that work and then generate a response. I've drawn some extra things here. I've drawn the database here, that's sort of external to this MVC, and that is talked to by the model. Over here we've got the web server. The web server, something like Nginx or Apache or our little Python development server, handles the request, so it receives the HTTP request and sends it to our controller module. So the controller is the thing that understands the requests, decides what's to do, and using the view, and the view is the thing that sort of generates the response or is used to generate the response. Arguably, I guess it would come from the controller as well, but the view generates the response, and we end up with a web page that is the response. And then of course we might get another request from that web page and go through the whole cycle again. So this is a way of looking at application architecture, a way of dividing things up. Now, I've drawn it as a bit of a fuzzy blob in here because there are different thoughts about what the rules ought to be in terms of who gets to talk to who. Some conceptualizations of MVC say that the controller can only talk to the model and the view is not allowed to do that, and so on. That, for me at least, is less important than just the idea of breaking the application up into recognizable and understandable parts and having some idea about how they should interpret each other, interoperate with each other. So we have the model, view, and controller, and they talk to each other in some way, and I'm not going to put sort of strict rules on that because there are lots of different ways to interpret MVC. If we look at this in terms of our application, we can very easily see that for our bottle application we have some parts that can be quite easily identified as model, view and controller. So in the main.py here, I've got this little sample application. I have the thing that handles the requests. So these are handlers. This is code that's going to be executed when we get a request like this. It's going to do some work and it's going to call the required template. So this is the controller. The template part here, there's the index.html template, contains little bits of code, but that code is only inserting data into the output. So it's not doing any computation, any actual work. It's just adding data into the view, into the output. So this is the view part. And then the database module defines the database and defines these procedures that we're writing to read and write things from the database. So add things to the database, get things out of it. And these are the procedures that get used in the rest of the application. So here, get likes, and there, add like. We're using those in this application to make it work. So in our case, the controller is calling the model and is also selecting which view should be used. And the view is just inserting data. It's passed data from the controller, and the database module is just talking to the database. That's great, but since you've not seen other examples, at least in Comp 249, it's sort of interesting perhaps to look at how else you would do it, because that might just seem like a normal way to do things because that's all I've shown you. So I've written what I'm calling my bad example here. And this is a little example application that's organized slightly differently. So what I've done in my main.py here is that I have in my, let's say in my post handler, so the thing that handles the form, instead of using a database module, I am just going to do the SQL insertion just here. That doesn't seem too bad. I've just got a few lines of SQL added in there. The table names are there and so on. So I can do my SQL insertion right there. That saves the need for that extra procedure. And in my index handler here, this is the thing that handles the index, I've got the database, and I'm just going to pass that directly to the view. So if we look at my index.html template here, when I want to generate a list of likes, I'm just going to do the query inside the template and then iterate over the rows that come out of the result, and that will work. That's great. So I've got a working application where I've got bits of SQL inside my template and bits of SQL inside my controller, and that's fine. But I don't need a database module then. I just run this one like this. The disadvantage of this, of course, is that I'm mixing things up a little bit. So I've got SQL in here, I've got bits of SQL here, I've got bits of SQL there, and these are sort of dependent on each other. If I need to change something about my database, such as the name, add new fields, or change the name of tables, or actually even use a different database altogether, then I need to go and find all the places that I've used SQL throughout my project and update them. Whereas if I have a database module like this, then I just have all of the database functionality in one place, and I can just update it there. Here's another version of that bad application where I've gone taken a slightly different route with the generation of the output. So I still have my SQL in my form handler here, but then I've also got SQL in my index handler, and I'm just going to go and select the thing from the likes, and then I'm going to construct some HTML here as a string. So I'm doing my UL and so on, and putting together an unordered list containing the rows, and then I'm going to pass that list that I've made up, that is a bit of HTML, into the template. And then in my template here, I'm going to actually
insert the result of that bit of HTML in here. I need the exclamation mark because it contains HTML markup. I just want it to be inserted as it is without being quoted. So there's yet another way to do it. The disadvantage here, of course, is that I'm mixing SQL in here with bits of HTML code, and it just looks messy. So if we compare this implementation of the controller that contains bits of HTML and bits of SQL and so on with the nice version of my controller, the nice version of my controller just says likes is get the likes, add a like here. The code here is much shorter. It is much easier to read. Now, this is a very simple application, so you can imagine how this is going to scale a bit better. Our routines are going to be nice and small and compact, whereas in the case of my other application, as this thing grows, it gets more and more complicated. As I want slightly different layouts for things, I'm going to have to go hacking in here and so on. And it just makes for very messy code, and it makes things very hard to read, and it makes things quite hard to maintain. So we want to aim for something like this, where we have very succinct calls to procedures that do things for us, and we sort of segregate those procedures into these modules for model, view, and controller. So the important message is not that model, view, controller is the one architecture that makes things work and they talk to each other in these kinds of ways, which some discussions of MVC will say. It is that we partition our code into meaningful and logical segments or parts in our application, and we understand how what those things are doing. We understand that the model, for example, is a thing that is going to read and write things to the database, and then we use those things from the rest of the application. So that's my little take on model, view, controller, why we use it, and how it is interpretable as in Bottle. Thanks.